you're going to read a poetry.
Yes. You want to read it?
No.
So while we're letting people in, welcome everyone. Welcome for this beautiful presentation today. We are doing a presentation with Dr. Hussein Adie. He has been very kind to join us today on this session. It is Tahereh, Forerunner of the Women's Liberation Movement of the East. And you see the title of the book in front of you, The Calling, Tahereh of Persia and Her American Contemporaries. Dr. Adie has studied this subject in quite depth, and we will be actually discussing that today. So for introductions, Dr. Adie was born and raised in Nehrez, Iran. He's a sixth-generation Baha'i, his ancestors figuring among the first in Nehrez to accept the Babi and later Baha'i faith. Hussein had immigrated to the United States as a young man of 17 years of age. Like many immigrants seeking a better life in America, he worked and attended college in the New York area. Hussein eventually completed a master's degree in European intellectual history and a doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts. Dr. Adie has had a distinguished career in education in New York. His proudest achievement, of course, is being one of the founders and assistant headmaster of the Harlem Preparatory School, a world-renowned charter high school for disadvantaged students. The school is credited with helping numerous people to rise from poverty to a better life. Dr. Adie also served as director of educational programs at Fordham University. That all being said, he is the author of the book you see in front of you today, and he also has a website you can visit to learn more. If you go to www.husseinadie.com, HUSSEINAHDIEH.com, you'll find out more about his book, The Forerunner, as well as more information and articles, interviews, and other materials that would be very useful to learn more. That being said, Dr. Adie, welcome.
Good afternoon, my friend.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be having you again for this beautiful talk we're about to have. And for those of you who are joining us, we're going to also have them next Sunday at 11 a.m. Please feel free to join for that talk as well on Abdul Baha.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. It was wonderful to hear you again. The presentation, as John mentioned, is going to be in two parts. As you notice, the title of the book that my good friend Hilary Chapman and I wrote, called The Calling, and Tahereh and Her Contemporary American Woman. The theme of the book is that in 19th century, at the same time that Tahereh made her claim in the East, in Persia, and we're going to follow her story today, there were a number of women in the West, especially in America, who also raised the call, and they invited people to join a new phenomenon. And this woman's, we will go in detail of their life and their contribution. Is like the founder of Christian Science movement, Mary Eddy Becker, Eddy, the movement of Shaker movements, movement of Seventh-day Baptists, and a whole bunch of other people that we would discuss next week, that dealing with this part of the world. But today, I'd like to concentrate as much as we can on her. Tahereh was a very unusual phenomenon in 19th century, and there has been so many books and so many articles are written about her. Somebody had said an estimate of 1,000 books and serious scholarly book has written about her. And it's quite interesting that even though historians and others always ignore the woman in the writing, you don't find much stuff about them. They always talk about the man, how brave they were, what they accomplished, what was their contribution, but hardly any mention of what the woman did. But somehow, some way, Tahereh is different and unique in terms of her learning. It was unusual in terms of her reading, her poetry, her ability to debate, to lecture. It was quite a phenomenon in her time. And it was as such that, for example, Professor Brown, Edward Brown, the famous Orientalist, mentioned that if Bob, the founder of Babi faith, had no other miracle to produce, just simply because a woman like Tahereh accepted his call, that is a miracle. So, and there is numerous other statements by different scholars and different writers in 19th century. They all talk about her. I think perhaps with the exception of Bob himself, there are more material or written about her than anybody else. And I have a feeling that the attention that the Western press and media gave to Tahereh and to the Bab also is only matched with what the attention they gave to Abdul Baha when he came to America. So this is what I want to say, that the magnitude of the attention and publicity that the faith got, it was either Bab himself, Tahereh, and then later on was Abdul Baha. Tahereh came from a very distinguished family of learned people, both through her father and mother. Her father was a religious scholar. Her uncle was one of the leading mullahs of Qazvin. He has married the king's sister, and he was amazingly prestigious all over the country and well known for his decision. I don't want to go in detail of all this craziness of division of Islam because they have so many branches and so many schools of thought that confuse everyone. But I would say that the big school of thought that developed in 19th century belonged to a man by the name Sheikh Ahmad Ahsa'i, who was the founder of Sheikhi movement. And it happened that the family of Tahereh were at the middle of this confrontation and this conflict between this man's school, Sheikhi, and her uncle and her family. So some of her family became Sheikhi, some did not, and eventually Tahereh herself, through using her cousin library, became familiar with the writing of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsa'i and started to correspond with his successor, Sayyid Qasim. And it was in that occasion that she was called Qurratul Ain, the solace of one eyes. From very beginning, Tahereh showed a tremendous ability and talent for learning, for teaching, and her father constantly complained that I wish this girl was a boy so he could reach the highest level of learned and become one of the leading ulama or learned person in Persia. How little the old man knew that even though it was a girl, it has reached that the highest point that he was hoping for. Her mother actually is this very interesting part. Her mother was also a very learned woman, and there was a school that teach the girls in city of Qazvin, and her mother was one of the main teachers in that school. When she was born, she was named Salame and Fatimeh, and later on was known also as Zarin Taj and all that. And the title of Tahereh originally was used by Bab, referring to her as Tahereh, and that was an interesting occasion. I can describe to you why. And then, of course, Baha'u'llah confirmed that tablet, in that name, I mean, in the conference of Badasht, when he was revealed tablet for different people, and he called different individuals with different name, and Baha'u'llah referred to this woman as Tahereh. How the name of Tahereh came about is interesting. I may be going all over the place. I know so much about this woman, I don't know where to stop. Because of her radical ideology and approach, some of the Babis complained to Bab that Tahereh is, Zarin Taj, Zarrin Taj means the golden hair. I have a feeling that because she was a little blonde, had some Turkish background, I think, in her blood. And so they call her Zarrin Taj, the golden hair. They complain to Bob that Bob, the Tahereh, is not behaving. She's doing lots of things, which is really causing lots of commotion and problem. And then Bob answered, what can I say about the woman who is the essence of purity, and she is the Tahereh. So that's how the name Tahereh came about. The name Qurratul Ain, as I mentioned, was given to her by Sayyid Kazem. And it's interesting that many of the Babis who became actually follower of her with some recognition of the Bab. You have to remember at that time, Bab was mostly in prison. There was not much communication from him with the believers. So some leading figure like Tahereh, like Quddus, Mullah Hussain, Wahid, and others in different parts of the country, they had their own circle of followers and people who they were teaching and preaching. And this group that they were surrounding and were around Tahereh, they are referred to as Qurratiyeh. That came from the name Qurratul Ain. This I thought I shared with you. Tahereh had a dream. She dreamed of this young man, Sayyid, who is high above in the sky with a green turban, with a black cloak around his shoulder, and he was reciting some lines that was very similar to Quranic writing. So Tahereh, being a bright woman and intelligent, either she woke up and she wrote it down, or she remembered the quote next day. And later on, when she came across a book written by Tahereh, by Bab, she found exactly that quote or that few lines that she was dreaming about. And that really confirmed her belief. At the same time, her brother-in-law, the one who married her sister, was traveling with Mullah Hussain, searching for the promised Qa'im. And she told this brother-in-law that if tell him that I want to be his follower and I love him. And of course—
Can you repeat that? You cut out in the part of what you were saying.
And she told her brother-in-law that if you ever meet Bab, please convey to him my love and my obedience and my fellowship of him to him. And he did that. And Bab appointed her as 17th letter of living. I guess you all know that Bab have 18 letter of living. These were the first people who accepted him, and Tahereh was the only one who recognized his station, even without seeing him. And the 18th one was a fellow named Quddus, which is also a very significant figure. A friend of mine, Nader Saidi, has mentioned in one of the emails that he sent to me that while he was in Haifa doing some research in research department, he came across a tablet from the Bab describing the station of Tahereh. And he said in that particular tablet, Bab has mentioned that the Tahereh is the station and contribution is superior to all the letters of living together, which is quite a wonderful and unusual station to refer. But of course, we know that Baha'u'llah has referred to Quddus as the most wonderful follower of the Bab. One of the wonderful attributes of Tahereh was her poetry. This is actually how she was known to a non-Baha'i circle all over the country. Because of her ability to lecture and to talk and her ability to poetically present herself, often what she would do throughout her talk, she began to recite few lines of poetry, and then she would continue to add her own lines. And so it is a combination of someone else's poetry plus hers. That's why it confused lots of people who have done research on her poetry, that is this hers or is not hers. But finally, I think some scholars in the last 10, 15, 20 years, when they published some anthology of her poetry, they distinguish which one is exactly hers, which one is not hers. One of the favorite one that I love, and those Persian friends who are in the groups or they know, it's called, and I want to read it to you so you get the sample or feeling of how her poetry sound like. Is it okay, John, if I read something? Okay. This in Persian called گر به تو افتادم نظر چهره به چهره رو به رو. This is very popular among Persian. This is the English translation, was done by Amin Banani and Professor, what was his name? Kessler, yeah, from University of California, Persian department. They translate this poetry. If I met you face to face, I would retrace, erase my heartbreak, pain by pain, ache by ache, word by word, point by point. In search of you, just you. Oh, this glass is no good. I'm sorry. In search of you, just your face, I roam through the streets, lost in disgrace, house to house, lane to lane, place to place, door to door. My heart hopeless, broken, crushed, I heard it pound till blood gushed from me, fountain by fountain, stream by stream, river by river, sea by sea. The garden of your lips, your cheeks, your perfume hair, I wandered there, bloom to bloom, rose to rose, petal to petal, scent to scent. Your eyebrow, your eye, and the mole on your face, somehow they tie me, trade to trade, kindness to kindness, passion to passion, love to love. While of grave, while of grave, while of grave, with love, your love I will reweave the fabric of my soul, stitch by stitch, thread by thread, wrap by wrap, woof by woof. Last, I, Tahereh, search my heart, I look line by line. What did I find? You and you, you and you, you and you. I think this is beautiful, and Amin has done a great job translating this. So this is a typical of her poetry, which made her so famous and so popular. What they tried to do, I'm just going again to other places, what they tried to do with the legacy and the memory of Tahereh, even her own family, they tried to ignore, erase anything to do with her while she was alive and shortly after she leaves. Even her own children ignored her mothers, and they even accepted the Babi cause. But then later on, thanks to people and scholars who recognize her poetry and her contribution, we still have the Tahereh in our heart, and we know her by her poetry and her writing. I want to talk a little bit about this business of hijab. You all heard the famous incident that took place in the conference of Badasht. Let's read more about it. So I tried to just give you the highlight of what I found about her. In the conference of Badasht, you realize that they said she removed her veil, and this creates such a commotion that even the believers got very upset that how come such a holy woman like Tahereh can do this. Now, the explanation for this is not just simply she removed her veil for the sake of just showing her face. Hijab, or covering the face, was one of the backbone in the way of Islam. We don't know whether this was from beginning, from a time of Prophet Muhammad, that this hijab or covering of face became popular, but then later on, throughout the centuries, especially in Shia sects or group in Persia and Afghanistan, this woman's covering of the face and body became so ingrained removing the veil wanted to break the tradition with the past. It was not just the idea that I, as a woman, I'm going to show my face. She wanted to show and to prove that the new day has come about. And the new day required the new laws, and the new laws has brought by the Bab. And I have an interesting feeling that she was even aware of the station of Baha'u'llah, because in her poetry that she writes that so much love and so much affection, it cannot be toward just an average man or typical Persian poetry. It must be through some ideal person or entity, and those entities undoubtedly are Bab and Baha'u'llah. The idea that Tahereh, even is a title of one of my book in Persian language, Tahereh, the forerunner of woman liberation in the East. It is a very appealing topic, and people go for that. And I like the idea topic. But I want to let you know that you don't find much in the Tahereh's writing dealing with the equality of man and woman, or the idea that the women are as good or in some occasion better than men. What my gut feeling is telling me that because of her faith and acceptance of the Bab, she became so in tune with those teachings that she lived the life of equality with men. Because how else she would do what she did? She would go and debate the major mullahs and learned men of Iraq and Persia. She would write. She appeared behind a curtain and giving lecture. There was an occasion in Tehran, they said she was sitting behind a curtain and had the Abdul Baha on her lap. And then great Wahid, the famous follower of the Bab, was in the other side of the curtain. And he started to talk very elaborating different parts of Islam, writing and tradition and hadith. So Tahereh started to raise her voice and yell at him. He said, "Great Wahid, time for the talk is over. Get up and go and do something." And poor Wahid, this is the most learned man in Persia, is sitting there, and this woman is telling him what to do and what not to do. Another thing that was popular those days, and I may be all over the place, but so what? There is a concept in Islam, they call it mubahala. You and I, we talk. We try to convince each other of who is right, especially some serious religious problem. Has Qa'im appeared? Is Bab the promised one? If we cannot convince each other, we go through a ritual. We all start to pray to God, and we ask God that please make the person who is wrong drop dead. This is quite harsh, that you pray that if the person don't agree with you, let him die. And Tahereh loved this procedure. Every time that they would not listen to her, he would offer to do mubahala. He said, let us pray, and whoever is wrong, hopefully would die. And they were so afraid to go through this with her that they would refuse, because you never know that she may be right and they drop dead. They don't want to go through that. But another cute thing that she did. I tell you, this woman was radical. No wonder they killed her. She was only 36 years old, by the way, when she was killed. Bob, was very creative. And sometimes he would do his writing in the red color, when tradition was always to read the thing in black ink. So, and of course, the non-Babis were always complaining that this is so cheap, writing in red color. What is this story? So they said in one of the gatherings in Kermanshah, what Tahereh did, she picked up a quote from Islam, from Quran actually, and she wrote it in the red color. And she picked up a quote from the Bab, and she wrote it in a black color. And she gave it to this fellow that he was debating with. And this guy, without even paying any attention what's in the content of the quotes, start to complain, what is this red writing? This is blasphemy, this is no good, and all that. And of course, shortly afterward, he found out this was really the writing from Quran. And imagine the kind of embarrassment that caused him. But she was doing this kind of thing. She was in Badasht, for example. I tell you some story that probably you never heard. That she was riding horse all around the place, and she was calling the people to break away from traditional way of saying the Muslim prayer and start to say the prayer according to Bob's writing. And you know, the good Muslim, when they put their head down on the ground, they have a piece of dirt or piece of something, clay, that they put their heads on that. She would go and remove the new day and new place.
Could you repeat the last bit a little bit? You cut out your sound. If you could repeat the last bit a little bit.
Yeah, last bit was that the Tahereh's notion throughout her life was to prove that the new dispensation is on the horizon. And we have to get away from the old-fashioned and traditional way. This put her in trouble with Qudus, even Qudus. This put her in trouble with some of the more conservative member of Baha'i community, Babi community. You know that in the Babi movement, it was not quite like Baha'i that we have a covenant, we have more or less going right straight path. There were different schools and different groups who didn't know quite where the teaching is. And Tahereh was leading the more radical groups. She was doing, I said that when the Muslims, they were going on the ground and to pray, they put their head down and they have a piece of a stone or clay. They put her and Tahereh would go and remove that and ask them to break away with that tradition. I think Tahereh was the Joan of Arc of the Baha'i Babi faith. She was Fatima of the Baha'i faith. She was Mary Magdalene of Babi faith. She was Ayesha, the wife of Prophet Muhammad of Babi faith. In every dispensation, there is one woman who is really shining, and Tahereh was the one who shined through that period. I was on one occasion, okay, let me just give you a brief history of her life so you know what I'm talking about. Tahereh, as I mentioned earlier, was born in Qazvin from a very distinguished religious family. She married to her cousin, who was just an idiot, by name Muhammad. They had 3 children, 1 daughter and 2 boys. And then she went with him to Karbala because he wanted to study Islamic tradition and writing. They came back. She became familiar with the Sheikhi school of thought. She became follower of Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazem. And then she was invited to go to Karbala to meet Sayyid Kazem. And at that point, the husband, of course, would not let her take the children. The husband kept the children. She and her sister and a few other people, they went to Karbala. Karbala at that point was a leading center of all the theological leaders and all that. And it was in Karbala that she found out that the master, Sayyid Kazem, is dead. His wife invited her to continue the lecture in their house. And in Karbala, she became the center of attention for all the sheikhis and later on the Babis. Because of her activity, because of the way she was carrying herself and her challenging the mullahs and the leader, she was forced to leave Karbala. She went to Baghdad and stayed in Baghdad, and a whole bunch of her followers, about 30 of them, they would go from town to town. They stayed with her. From Baghdad, she eventually came back to Qazvin by the invitation of her father. When she came back, there was a family gathering, and her uncle was in that, Mullah Muhammad Taqi, who was the leading mullah or religious leader in Qazvin, one of the most powerful figure in Persia, and because he married the king's sisters and all that. In this meeting, Tahereh, of course, began to talk about Bab and his teaching and all that. And this Mullah Taqi, her uncle, got so upset that he slapped her on the face, which was quite unbecoming, to slap a woman in the public, in that gathering. And Tahereh turned to him and he said, "Uncle," I'm paraphrasing, "that was awful thing you did, and I see blood in your mouth." That's just a statement. And unfortunately, 2 days later, a crazy Babi killed this man in the mosque while he was at the middle of prayer in the early morning. And naturally, they all blamed Tahereh for killing of her uncle. She was arrested. She was put under house arrest, and on the second floor of this house, I think her father's house, she was put there, and it was constantly under threat of being killed. At this point, Jalal Baha, the one that we know later as Baha'u'llah, intervened, sent some people to rescue her. They came overnight. They sent a message to her to be prepared. They put the ladder against the wall. They went through the window. They got her out, and their horses were waiting outside. This is so beautiful. They're going to make a movie out of this thing in the future. I think somebody should make a big movie. They got on the horses, and they left Qazvin, and they pick up some very unusual route to go to Tehran because they knew they'd be followed. So they got to Tehran, and Janab Baha was waiting for them, Baha'u'llah, and start the protection of this woman for the next few years. After a couple of months, they all attended the conference of Adash, and you know the story of that, I think 81 of them, they get together in that beautiful place in Khorasan, and Quddus was there, Baha'u'llah was there, many people were there. And the purpose of this conference was to resolve two issues. One, to find a way of rescuing Bab from the prison, because at this point, I think Bab was either in Maku or Tahirih, and they wanted to rescue him. That did not succeed, they couldn't do that. But then the second item for the conference discussion was, what is Babi fate, and where do we go from here? And it was here that some, at least theatrical conflict developed between Tahereh and Quddus, that each one pick up different school of thought, and there was confrontation, and you should read Dawnbreaker and to know more about it. So after the conference, at this point, Tahereh was a fugitive because she, as I told you, she was accused of killing her uncle, and the government was after her. So for a period of 2 years, she was hiding in all kind of places in the state of Mazandaran and Gilan. And it was during this period, actually, that the Sheikh Tabarsi's crisis was going on. And she wanted so much to join the defender of Tabarsi, Mullah Hussein, Quddus, and others. But Baha'u'llah discouraged her and told her that all the roads are closed and there is no way that she can make it to the fortress. Eventually, after 2 years of wandering around and hiding and teaching and doing all kind of things, she was captured by governmental soldiers. They brought her to Tehran, and they put her in the house of mayor of the city, Mahmud Khan. And for the rest of her life, which I think lasted 2 years, she was a prison in their house. Many things happened in that years that she was in Kalantar's or in Mahmud's house. Stories about that. But the significant thing is that even while she was there, she became the center of affection and attention of many people who would come to visit her. It was during this period, the story goes, that Nasruddin Shah, the king, offered to marry her. He wrote a letter to her. This is, I don't know how true this is, but there must be some truth to it, that he offered her to marry her, and so she became the sort of the leading woman in his harem. I think she had 67 wives. I don't know how the hell. I have one wife, I'm going crazy, and this man had 67 wives. God help him. So Tahereh refused, and she answered with a beautiful line of poetry. Let me see if I remember it. To takht taj Sekandari, banu rah rand qalandari. Agar you and your kingdom and your throne, if that please you, let it be. My ways is a wandering dervish, and I'm happy with my ways. You stay in your way, and I go in my way. This was the essence of her answer. Otherwise, thank you very much, I don't want to marry you. And so that, I'm sure, upset the king even more. So eventually, a fatwa or a statement was issued by mullahs, 2 leading mullahs of Tehran, and they said that she had to die. At the middle of night, they came and they took her to the garden Ilkhani, they call it. And again, she was prepared for that. She knew it's coming. It's a very colorful, beautiful story that Nicholas described, that famous French scholars. And they took her scarf and they strangled her and they threw her in the well, and they thought they would kill her. How little they knew that the name of Tahereh would live forever. Many years later, this interesting part, Martha Root, the great woman journalist Baha'i that was traveling, she stopped in Qazvin, and she found out where is Tahereh's house. And she went to that house. And then the owner of the house, who was one of the descendants of Tahereh, saw this American woman prostrated on the floor and kissing the floor of the room that Tahereh used to live, and crying and crying and crying. And he told everyone else that we ignore our ancestor, our beloved woman Tahereh, and look at this Farangi, look at this foreigner who come all the way from a strange land and is doing this. I need, if you buy my book, save your money or give me your email address. I can send you the PDF. You can give me your email address through the chat and we send it to you. You will see lots of comments and stories of the people who say things about Tahereh. It's unusual how they love, how they praise, and how recognize this great lady of Persia. She was 36 years old when they killed her. And it's interesting that it took many years later for the American woman to even get the right to vote. I think it was 1920. Eventually they got the right to vote, and now it's 2020. 100 years later, a century has gone by. And still, even in this country, forget about what's happening in that crazy Persia. Even in this country, we are struggling as far as the question of equality concerned. So in that country, I think Tahereh definitely was in forefront of the liberation of the woman, even though she did not necessarily advocate any liberation, but she lived the life of liberated woman. And that was the best example that one can find. I have a collection of the pictures that I'd like to go over them, and then I can talk about it. Please, could you show them?
Mm.
So while we're loading, Dr. Adia, okay, there we are. Oh, no, I guess not. Jeremiah, do you have
No, I'm going back. I think I'm going to, let's see now. Do you see it?
Do you see this man? Go back.
Do you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes, but you've been going forward.
Okay, I'm going back. Where am I? Gosh.
Bottom left, there's an arrow if you want to go back that way. Yep.
There you go. We are almost at the beginning. Right. Okay.
This is the man, most likely this is a drawing of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsai. He was born originally in what is called Bahrain. And it's very interesting. For those of you and all that, this man was able to really combine all this philosophical discussion and tradition of Islam in one school of thought, which was very fresh and very unusual. Many people before him, they believe, for example, that the things are happening physically. When you said the Qa'im is coming, they thought it's the same Qa'im or same one who disappeared 1,000 years ago. In physical capacity, he would come back. But his ability was that it was not really the body of Qa'im or Mahdi would come back, but it was the spirit of the Mahdi or the promised one that would return. And there's a whole bunch of other things about Shaykhi school of thought that people have done lots of research on that. And it's interesting, within a short time, law really has its roots in this school of thought. This is the famous mosque in Qazvin, which is not far from where Tahereh used to live. And her father and her uncle used to preach in this mosque. And her mother was conducting some classes for women. This is the nice drawing by a friend of mine, is the her house library that Tahereh was used. Very fancy house. Oh, this is Karbala in 19th century. Karbala is considered a sort of the same thing as Rome, that you know, Pope is there and this and that, all the minister and priests are there. Karbala was the place to go to study for years and years to become a mujtahid. You know, I just want to tell you something to learn. In Islam, there are two groups of people. Either you are a leader and you become a leader in religious subject after many years of study. They call it mujtahid. Or you are a follower. You are an average person like me, which is 99% of the population. They are the follower, or they call them muqallid. So Karbala was the place, if you're going to be a follower, leader, the place to go, and sometimes would take 20, 25, 30 years of study before you reach that point, and you become Ayatollah. Thanks. Oh, these are the, I have seen this thing, even though it doesn't exist anymore, but I have seen a couple of them. It was an interesting theatrical setup that these people who were professional performers, they would come to your town, they display some drawing and some painting around, and they start to tell their story. They would tell the story of how Imam Hussein, for example, was martyred in Karbala. They would tell the story of how Alexander the Great came to Iran and destroyed Persepolis. Or they tell the story of, so this was the sort of thing that would, it's a theater, like the Shakespeare was doing in England in much more fancier way. This was our little theater in our villages and towns. Oh, this is the, you know, Bob wrote individual tablet for each letter of living. This is the one that he wrote for Tahereh. This is the scene of the conference, the famous conference in Badasht, is in the province of Khorasan. And as I said, it lasted 21 days. It was attended by 81 people. Most of these people who attended this conference were really the leading Babis of the country. And I mentioned that there was a tree garden that Baha'u'llah has rented, one for Quddus and the people with him, one for the Tahereh and her companion, and one for himself. And there were lots of tents was set up, and they had a good conference. I think this was the first Baha'i conference. This is the place that eventually Tahereh was arrested. It was, I think, the village called Waz. And there was a small village in the mountain of Mazandaran, and she was mostly in hiding, but I think somebody betrayed her, and they came and arrested her in that village. What is this?
The meaning of Quratul Ain.
Oh, okay. Oh, this is a rough drawing of traveling that was doing, you know, that she was going from, this was, imagine a woman in 19th century by herself, go with her sister or few female companion, traveling from Qazvin, Karbala, Baghdad, back to Qazvin, Badasht, go to Mazandaran, bring to Tehran. This was really the drawing that we did just to show some of the places that she was traveling. Oh, this is this Nasruddin Shah was an awful person. He was the one who was responsible for the martyrdom of the Bab, and many of the upheavals of Niriz, of Tabarsi, and Zanjan happened during his term. Somehow, I don't know why God was so merciful to him. He was king for almost 50 years, but eventually he was assassinated. I think, yeah, this is the answer that Tahereh gave to King of when he made the offer to marry her. Oh, this is a horrible person. That's the one who actually killed Tahereh in that garden. He was a military man, Aziz Khan, and he and a few of his companion or soldiers in that garden at middle of night, they put the end to the life of this heroine. This is the where that garden, when Tahereh was killed, Then later on, I think became an entrance to a famous bank, Bank Melli. And this is the entrance to that garden. This is the location that she was killed and buried, the garden. And this is a drawing of her face. There's no painting, there's no drawing of Tahereh. So whatever you see is just imagination of the people that they make her. I doubted that Tahereh was using lipstick. This is her handwriting. Oh, by the way, even though she was a poet, but I have read some of her writing is much superior to her poetry. Quite sophisticated, and lots of scholars are quite impressed with her writing. And that's the cover of the book that we're going to talk more about it next week about American woman. So, John, I think this is my part of presentation. I'm willing and hopefully able to answer question if anybody has any question.
Yes, of course. So the questions that we have, number one, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So when Tahereh was called golden hair, you mentioned, for example, that she may have had ancestry that would allow for that. Do you think it was maybe symbolic more so than it was actual? Maybe she actually didn't have golden hair. Maybe she had, brunette black hair.
I'm not quite sure, but I think definitely she was called Zarrin Taj. That name is repeated again and again in different places. So I imagine in Qazvin, that part of that form, there were a large number of Turkish individuals, and lots of Turks are blonde and have blonde hair. And so it's possible because, remember, Turks was very close to European continent. So there's lots of interaction and all that. So it's possible that in some of family member that she has in the past, there may have been some Turkish blood, maybe. And that's why she had this. And sometimes actually, even Tatiana told me that in her childhood, she was blonde. And we don't know what happened when she grew up, her hair became black. So it's possible that she was just blonde hair, and they call her Zarrin Taj. One thing I know that even though she was named Fatime, but they did not, or almost Salame, because her grandmother had the same name for many years while the old lady was alive, they would not call the kid Fatime. They would call her different name. And I think I read some place called Zarrin Taj or Zakiye, I think. So they would call her different name than Fatime until she died, and I guess they used her name also.
Because I know in Persian culture that when they refer to you as golden, it's also, it could be viewed in a good or positive light, depending on who says it and what tone they say it. But typically, it's respectful, giving importance to the person if you call them golden.
That's quite possible. Yes, sure. Golden because it's a color of the gold, and so and being gold means so significant. It's precious. Yeah.
Yeah. So the golden boy, the golden girl.
Exactly. You are a golden boy.
So we have questions now. The questions, I'm going to get to the first ones I see for those who are leaving them, and I'm going to go in order as we receive them. So we have from Molly DeWald, an item was said, there is such a mystery of Qudus. He was called His Holiness. Not much is noted about his station. He was a descendant of Muhammad and the soulmate of the Bab. Can you relate a little further on the relationship of Qudus and Tahereh? Because it's my understanding that Badasht was, the disagreement that they had was more of an act for those who were present, more so than it was actually a disagreement between each other.
Yeah, Qudus is very significant figure. And she was actually, I think he was the youngest Latra Bibin, I'm not sure, 20-some, early 20s. This is amazing that these people who fall in love with Bab and did some miraculous work, They were all in their 20s. And Tahereh was killed when she was 36. Wahid was martyred when he was 40. Bob himself was in his, I think, early 30s, 20s. It's this Qudus and others. I read someplace that the station of Qudus was so important that if Bob would delay claiming his station for a moment, Qudus was in the wing to do the same thing. Otherwise, he had the potentiality and he had the ability to right away move in and do the claim. We know from Baha'u'llah's writing that he referred to Qudus as the second most important person in the Babi dispensation. We know that. I hope and I wish one day, there are not much material available in English literature, English paper about Qudus. If I don't die, survive this corona, one of my project is to write either a series of articles or maybe write a book about Qudus, because we don't know much about her in the Western world. There are some material available in Persian and Arabic, but not in English.
Thank you for that.
The question of playing game in Badash between Tahereh and Qudus is quite possible, because these two, they were all really follower of the Bab, so they love him. There may have been some differences of how to approach different subject of an area, but it was not. It was sometime you play game in order to make a point. And I think Shoghi Effendi probably has said that, or somebody else, that this could be. One thing about Shoghi Effendi, I like to remind the friends, that the humility and how humble this man was, that you see in his writing, even though God Passes By and Dawnbreaker is a master historical work, he said that whatever I have written and whatever you see here is my humble contribution to the history. Undoubtedly, in future, other historians would come about and would do more research and do more study, and they would come up with new idea and new revision. Just wait for that. This is really wonderful attribute of Shoghi Effendi's writing. So we could maybe in future come up and find out that what was really exactly the nature of this friction, at least on the surface, between Tahereh and Qudus.
So there's another question,
yes.
And this question is from Mona Moazez. She's asking, who documented the story of the murder of Tahereh and her death?
It's very colorful description of her death by Nicholas. Nicholas was a French consul general in Tabriz, and we really owe to him lots of material that are referred to, and he was a typical European scholar, not like Eastern, in Persia or in Arab country. They spend lots of time to play with words and admiring each other and doing, you read the whole page and you don't know what the hell the guy trying to say, because he keep talking about something that is going to happen later. But with this man, it seems that he has talked and he has traveled and he has collected some material. How much of this material are really historically true, we would probably never know. For example, he mentioned that the last word of Tahereh in the garden of Ilkhani, when they martyred her, was, "You may kill me, but you can never stop the emancipation of the woman." I mean, who was there to record this and to say that this is what Tahereh said and things like this? But I'm sure Tahereh has said something that deal with some subject, but then of course, by the time Nicholas began to write about it, it became more colorful and more elaborate. So his writing, even the night that she was in the house of mayor, and then the mayor's son accompanied her on the horses at nighttime, and they all covered them because they were afraid the Babis may try to rescue her. And they went to the garden, and a bunch of them were drunk, and what they did and how they took the kerchief out of a scarf out of her neck and strangled her. These are all the stories that we know from Nicholas. And so God bless him. And I use his writing a great deal to write The Calling and also to write my other book about Wahid. And because he wrote also extensively about Wahid and Neris of Habar.
Thank you so much for that. That's amazing. To realize that, you know, such an observer has such importance. It's not very common that one realizes that what they write will be so valuable to so many. That being said, we have a question from Alex Boyson, and his question is, can you conjure any similar revolutionary declaration or life work that was effective in changing or influencing society in human history, like Tahereh's? And he also further elaborates, this could include any woman or man with similar qualities as she had, who had a similar effect on others and in society and on society. So I know you mentioned people like Mary Magdalene and other important religious figures. I think his question is also in that regard, but also in wider society that people can think of.
I think of Tahereh more of Jane Austen when it comes to poetry and writing. And I think of her more as far as her bravery concerned, more of the Joan of Arc. And I think of Tahereh more of the youngest wife of Prophet Muhammad, Ayesha. You know that Ayesha was a young wife of Muhammad. And then later on, when the fraction started between Sunni and Shia, she was one of the leading figures in the Sunni movement, that they said she was riding camels and waging war against Imam Ali and against Shias throughout her life. And I think of, these are the figures that I think of, a combination of talent, bravery, assertiveness, and things like this. This is how I picture Tahereh. Who else I can think of in the history? I'm sure, and there was actually, they have done some study on some of the mystical figure in Islam that they are quite interesting, some in the writings and things like this. And they put Tahereh along those figures because lots of her poetry is indeed very mystical.
That's interesting. I don't think a lot of people know who Ayesha is. If you could kindly elaborate on that point.
Ayesha, this is a shame because of this friction between Shia and Sunni. You all know that after Prophet Muhammad died, there was a dispute who's going to replace him. Sunnis, which are 90% of the believers these days in the world, accepted Abu Bakr's leadership as Khalif, as the first Khalif. He was an elder man, he was learned, he has saved the life of Muhammad in many occasions, he was well loved by many people. Then there was a smaller number of believers who they said that actually Prophet Muhammad wanted to appoint his son-in-law Ali as his successor. So they became Shia, and then other became Sunni. The daughter of this Abu Bakr, her name was Ayesha, and in the Sunni's world, if you go to Turkey or if you go to any other Indonesia, the same way that Fatima is so popular, name Ayesha is very popular among them. But of course, in Iran, when they want to insult somebody, they said, "What's the matter with you? Are you Ayesha or something? Otherwise, you're no good." But this woman grew mad.
You just cut out. Can you repeat that? This woman, what?
She was very young. She was very beautiful. She was a daughter of Abu Bakr, and Prophet Muhammad married her because this would add more prestige to his station as a prophet. And then later on, when Muhammad died and Ayesha grew up, she became a strong leader, even in the military field. And as I mentioned earlier, she was in charge of waging war against the Shia and against Imam Ali. That's Aisha. If you want to know more about her, please Google her. I'm not the Baha'i Google. I'm kidding.
Well, thanks for the exposure. A lot of people, I think, definitely learned quite a bit. And yeah, definitely everyone, Google it. There's a lot more to learn. So there is, let's see. Jeremiah, I think I lost track of the questions. Are there any others?
I do not believe so, unless there's some on Facebook.
All right. Well, Alex did ask a question to me, I see privately. He asked, could the revolution in the fortunes and privileges of women in Iran have taken place? Alex, do you want to ask a question? Just unmute yourself. Yeah. Here you go, Alex. He's asking, could the revolution in the fortunes and privileges of women in Iran have taken place without her? That was his question.
Most likely. I think the progress of any movement is an ongoing progress. Of course, the individual, I think, come to the scene, and sometimes their role is to push it further, to add their strength to the movement. But I think the history has its own cycles of progress. And undoubtedly, of course, the coming of the Bab and Baha'u'llah was initiating the whole springtime of the new movement, and Tahereh was part of that. And I just want to emphasize again that Tahereh, simply because she was a Babi, and because Babi and Baha'i teaching stand for equality, is therefore she was in the forefront of the movement, and she lived the life of a liberated woman as an example. That's the thing we have to remember throughout our learning. She may not necessarily advocate. She had so many other things to deal with and to argue with that I don't think so. I come across any place that she said that man and woman are equal. But then simply by dumping her husband was an act of equality, because it was unusual in that country for a woman to leave the husband or divorce the husband. There was one occasion that after some time when she was in Karbala and Baghdad, other places, this husband of hers, Muhammad, wrote to her, "Oh, Tahereh, if you come back to Qazvin, if you promise to behave and to obey what I'm saying, I'm willing to take you back." So of course, what Tahereh does, she answered him very nicely, said, "Okay, let me tell you something, Muhammad. If you would have come to Baghdad and Karbala, and she would walk in front of my horse and hold the leash of the horse on foot and carry me from town to town, I may have considered returning to you. But what you have done is that our separation is forever in this world and the next world." This is really equality. No, I don't have to. She doesn't have to say we are equal, but she just express it and let it go.
Thank you for that. Thank you. There is a question from Molly DeWald. And Molly, if you want to unmute to ask the question, it's a good question to ask.
Oh, you want me to? I put it on chat. Did you want me to?
Yeah, do you want to read your question?
Oh, sure. How are the Sunnis accepting the Bab and Baha'u'llah's revelation? Are they expecting the return of a Sunni prophet, or are they just accepting our revelation?
It's a very difficult question to answer. You know that the basic tenet of the Babi and later on the Baha'i faith and all that is based on Shia's school of thought. They believe in 12 Imam, they believe in Ali was the righteous successor. They believe, as Baha'i, we believe in lots of those things. And for Sunnis to accept the Babi and Baha'i faith is a bit more difficult than the Shias, for sure. But then, for example, I tell you, when I wrote the book called Awakening, that deal with the life of Wahid and Bab and how he accepted and what happened. And we were hoping to translate that to Arabic, because the book was translated to many languages and somebody wanted to do it in Arabic language. The difficulty we had was that the essence of that book and many other Baha'i books is really based on tenet of Ali's successor, Muhammad. So it's going to be difficult to really convey that. So we have to change the whole approach and all that. So I gave it up. So that's why it's very interesting. Sometime in this non-Shia's country, the faith has become accepted religion, like Indonesia, which is 99% of them are Sunnis, but they accept the Baha'i faith as an independent religion. Or you go to some of other places that they the same, but in those countries, a Shia country like Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq, they hate Baha'is. So I think eventually we would find a right answer how to approach. At least I don't know how to explain it and how to approach the Sunnis as far as the Baha'i faith concerned.
Thank you.
Sure.
Very good.
These are pretty interesting questions, huh? Is there anything, Dr. Adia, that you would like to add, like one of the stories that you had about Tahereh that aren't commonly heard?
Tatiana, what do you suggest? Do we know anything? Can we say anything else about Tahereh?
This mystery box that they are talking about?
Yeah, there's all something. Tatiana, my assistant, just remind me that the last 2 days of Tahereh's life, when she was sort of praying and fasting and preparing herself for the martyrdom, it's all according to Nicholas. She prepared a box and a lock's box and gave it to the wife of the Kalantar, the wife of the mayor, and told her that someone would come and claim this box. And at least I don't know. I mean, do you know who was that woman?
No.
Nobody knows who was that woman and what was contained in that box. It could be some of her writing, some of her jewelry, and things like this. This is one thing I remember. Another story I remember about her, that while she was staying in the mayor's house, there was a wedding. The son of mayor was getting married. And usually, in a typical wedding, the bride and groom would get all the attention. But they said the Tahereh's being there, it created such a circle of affection and attention that majority of the guests were around her, listening to her poetry and her talks and things like this, and ignoring almost the poor bride and the groom. The story goes that she really wanted to join the Mullah Hussein and Quddus in Tabarsi, and she even prepared herself, had the men's clothes ready to dress as a man and cut her hair and go to the fortress of Tabarsi, and it was Baha'u'llah that stopped her. The story goes, for example, at the earlier days when she was in Karbala, her follower, the other Babis, they loved her so much that they had this custom that in the morning when they go shopping for meat or bread or something, they would bring it to her present so she could gaze on it and sort of bless it, or as I guess my Jewish friends say, kosher, make it a kosher. And so this was a tradition. Oh, another thing they said about Tahereh, that's the first day of Muharram is the birthday of the Bab, and it was a happy, a jolly, and joyful occasion. So she would dress very colorfully, sometimes even in red. And then at the same time, Muharram is the month that Imam Hussein was martyred. And so in the same month that 99.9% of the people were upset that Imam Hussein was martyred, this lady has happy, maybe play music. I don't know what kind of music she played. Definitely was not rock and roll. And then she would sing a song and she had friends and all that. So these were what I see in her and in all the stories I heard about her, a unique and unusual person. Her escape from Qazvin. Can you imagine coming down on the ladder from a window, horses are waiting, and jump on the horse and escape from a town and travel hundreds of miles to go to Tehran so they would not be put to death by the folks in town. These are the stuff for a movie that in future they're going to do it. Okay.
That is extremely interesting because if you think about it, you have such norms that were completely not anymore followed by Tahereh. She completely disregarded, even though they were she was taught in one of the most conservative households. It was what she, with not just will and determination, but with knowledge, she went and completely opposed that old system because she was empowered by a new revelation of the Bab. But it's intriguing, like the way that you've mentioned these stories about Tahereh. Not once was it the modern individualist attitude of I'm going to do what I want. It was in a very they say in Farsi khunsard. It was in a very sweet and very becoming way of a respectful person, not someone who is simply going to war with you. Does that make sense?
That's very true. That's very true.
It's very intriguing with the statement you talked about with the husband about being told to, in the matter of the divorce, in such a succinct way that expresses so much emotion and not just merely making a statement, but the sentiment of his responsibility of a husband and not having met that responsibility, but without actually telling it in a positional way.
That's right. That's right. My heart goes sometimes to her daughter. She had a very sweet daughter, very close to her mother, and of course the father would prevent her from associating with the mother. And the story goes that very shortly after that Tahereh was killed, she died from depression and from sadness. This was her daughter also. It was quite a life that this poor girl, his mother and daughter had.
Did this daughter get married by chance? Do you know anything about this daughter beyond that?
So she got married. No, she was too young. Don't know. I really don't know. No, I doubt it. But her two sons, they became some of the leading mullahs and of the city of Qazvin and Iran, and there are lots of reference to them. The family of Tahereh, I think I mentioned that, or I don't know. They tried to, as much as they could, to erase her name and her memory possible, because they knew they would be subject to all kind of a bad treatment. And it was really the Baha'i faith and Baha'is who maintained the goodness of this lady, and was her poetry and her writing that survived and eventually became an international phenomenon.
It's amazing how it's a shame that her own family, to save their, of course, respect in the community, they disowned their own ancestor in this point. So it's very intriguing that the only, as you're putting it, the only people who have really beyond historians of the West and so forth, and like the Russian play that was made about the Babi movement and included Tahereh and all that, the only people of Iranian descent that really have kept her memory alive and have respected her so much were the Baha'is. What about modern day, where you have increasingly, I guess, less conservative influences? what is your perception on the Iranian mood towards Tahereh and her memory?
I have a mixed feeling about this subject. I can understand the ignorance of average Persians when it comes to Baha'i faith or Babi faith, that because they didn't have enough study or research or their own brain, they didn't like us. What upset me is the intellectual and the writers and the higher echelon of Persian society, that they never gave us a break. And historically, of course, they ignore us, and then later on, they claim that the Baha'is are the product of either Russian intelligence service or British and Israelis or no American. We were always agent of some foreign countries. And this really, lots of them believe in that, because I have many, at least I used to before I stopped avoiding them. They really believe that Baha'i faith was a product of a British empire. Why? Because how come they give a title of Sir to Abdul Baha? For God's sake, drop dead. They gave him the title of Sir because of what he did during the First World War and saving the lives of so many people in Palestine. Then they said that he was a Russian ambassador who was involved in creating the Babi movement. And then they said we are Israeli agent because our central headquarters is there, not realizing that we were 100 years before there, before even Israeli and Israel was created. And now, of course, we are a product of CIA and America. So, but one thing has happened for last, I would say, 10, 20 years. They begin to realize the fallacy of all this thought. And even not long ago, there was a statement was issued by hundreds of Iranian writers and intellectuals, was signed by them, apologizing to the Baha'is and saying that what a horrible thing has happened in the past by what they did. So as you mentioned, there is a degree of recognition that this faith is going to stay, this faith is legitimate, this faith is not product of any foreign government. And unless and until the Iranian society solve this problem of Baha'i faith, believe me, forever they will curse. The same thing in this country, that they have to resolve the question and the problem of the race. And otherwise, forever they're going to be cursed and they have problem. The same thing in Iran. Unless they resolve the question of the Baha'i faith, I think they are in trouble.
That's amazing, though. It's amazing. Thank you for elaborating on that point, because
Sure.
It's seldom a subject that we really get to talk about to understand like what the modern intellectuals are thinking. Because I've seen on media from representatives of different intellectual organizations what they may or choose to or choose not to say about a certain subject, but understanding what the current norm is. You know that there's a lot of youth, though, who they don't ascribe to the older generation, particularly the people who are probably in their 20s and 30s in Iran. Are they also ascribing to this older view, or are they, by your feeling, changing their tone towards someone like Tahereh and the great Iranian people who gave their lives for the freedom of their countrymen?
It's amazing that I mean, sometimes Baha'is have a tendency of exaggerating. They said that there are millions of Iranians these days. They are willing to accept the Baha'i faith because in their heart they begin to realize that all these years they were fooled by all this stuff that was spreading about the Baha'is and how decent and how straightforward and how glorious is this faith. Now we have a TV and radio program which is broadcast to Iran in Persian language, and they sometimes make a report of what is the reaction of the people who listen to this kind of program. And it's quite unusual to listen to some of this reaction, the email, the voice messages we receive from average folks throughout the country, that they shows their willingness to be impartial, to be loving, to be understanding, and they all want to know more about the Baha'i faith. And God bless them. We are getting there, and we are going to make it.
And the hope is in the young generation.
And of course, the hope is in young generation, as you said, is 20s and 30s. They are the ones who are going to make it.
Well, thank you so much for talking about this subject. And more importantly, thank you for coming out today, everyone who attended. But more importantly, Dr. Adia, thank you for taking the time to, of course, study this very rich subject and to share some of your learning with us, so that we can also investigate and learn these very important gems for ourselves. And for those of you who have expressed your desire to, of course, get access to the literature, you've given your emails in the chat. Jeremiah has received that, and he's going to be reaching out to you through Dr. Adia, his materials. Sorry, wrong way around. Jeremiah will be reaching out to you with Dr. Adia's materials as is provided.
Sure.
So
thank you for inviting me, John, and thank you. Really, it was a wonderful opportunity I had to talk about my favorite lady.
yes, and thank you, Tatiana, as well, for assisting in making this possible too.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure.
I love everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hossein John. Hossein, you speak wonderful. This is Faride from the Palm Beach, Florida.
Farida, I love you.
I love you. میدونی که جورج فوت کرد.
I know all about it. I've been telling friends how much I miss George. Yes, George was a wonderful soul.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed so much your speak this morning about Abdul Baha and also now about Hazrat Tahereh. I was talking to Mr. Farib Sobhani, how you talking about Ayesha. He said what Ahdi said is wonderful. He adds something. He said Ayesha said because people saying Prophet Muhammad is the last. Ayesha said no, he's not the last prophet. That part, I just want to add it,
Thank you.
Really, 80% of Islam, respect Ayesha. Thank you, Hossein John. Pray for me and George. And I am very heavy-hearted. I miss George very much, and he loves you so much.
Of course. Take care, Farida John. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night. Goodbye.
Thank you.